Eamon McAnaney, ESPN lacrosse is where he was dominating, and now he's doing such at SNY in New York City. Anchor, reporter. This is something you've always dreamed about, Eamon, and being in New York City and dominating. And we're going to talk about your career, have some fun. Also, you are a Peloton enthusiast, and we'll get into your crazed workout regimen, which is pretty inspiring, and also your philanthropy. And as it relates to lacrosse and everything you're doing in the community, you can follow Eamon on Twitter at EMACSNY. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley and Anchor at Fox Sports Radio. So this is a chance to look at your career, what has been inspiring about it. And I wanted to start here, Eamon. Where has your wife come in and been the biggest support for you in your career?
Just being able to do it, it's not an easy career to get going. You got to make a lot of sacrifices. You don't get paid a lot. You got to work a lot of nights and weekends, and you got to ask people around you to help you out a lot and do a little bit more. It's not easy traveling every weekend. It's not easy taking every odd job at the last second. To be about 10 years ago, I had two of the greatest jobs I ever wanted. I was calling lacrosse games and I was freelancing a ton for SNY. So that's great for me, but it's not great when you have two young boys and SNY calls you at the last minute and says, someone called in sick. Can you anchor the 11 o'clock show tonight, when it was your turn to make dinner and put everyone to bed? So, it was that ability, her covering me and my ability to take every odd job at the last minute, certainly where the most support came through, because you don't get just leave and drop out the hat, but that's what TV expects you to do, especially when you're freelancing.
How much do your two boys appreciate now that you have this steady job at SNY? I'm sure more or less you have a schedule and you're not traveling as much.
They're teenagers. They don't appreciate anything. I think I appreciate it more. I mean, you look back at, making a big change in your life. And at the time, I felt personally I had to decide whether I wanted to go play-by-play exclusively or SNY studio exclusively. And I chose the studio, and I didn't necessarily, quality of life wasn't the biggest factor, but it certainly has turned out to be. I coached my son's CYO basketball team for a couple of years. I'm able to take them to practices and able to go to more games because I'm in town more. So I think I appreciate it a lot more than they do. I think maybe when they get older and they look back and realize that I'm around a lot more the last 5 years than I was the 5 years before that, and, can take them outside to play hoops or have a catch, I think they'll appreciate it. But right now, sort of as teenagers, it's just, the grumpy old man who makes them do stuff they don't want to do.
Yeah, it's that age where they know it all already, but they'll find out as they mature that you had so many good things that they finally will pick up on down the road. Eamon McAnaney is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. What is your approach to coaching your kids, and even like on the basketball court, lacrosse? What is that like for you?
I'm kind of a lunatic, to be honest with you. And, I wish, basketball is kind of, I watched my sons play baseball a lot. I never coached them in baseball, but baseball is kind of a slow moving game. Not a whole lot happens. Basketball is the exact opposite, especially when you have 5 kids on the floor and 3 of them don't remember that you told them you're in zone and are playing man-to-man, or you told them you're in man-to-man and we're playing zone, or we forgot to press, but the press is on. So I kind of was a maniac as a team coach. I think when I'm with my kids individually, I have to remind myself that I'm just there having a catch. I'm dad. I don't need to be the coach. Don't ruin it by being a coach. I mean, certainly you want to give them a pointer here and there, but the way I try to approach it is, you're just having quality time with your child. Let him shoot any way he wants to shoot, or, let him throw any way he wants to throw. Hopefully sooner or later, the message about how to do it the right way will get through. But and don't get me wrong, it's not easy. When they're shooting the wrong form and the right form, you're dying to tell them where to put the elbow and how to put the fade away, or the follow through. But I have to teach myself and remind myself, let's just have fun. You're here for an hour. Don't ruin it by thinking you're John Wooden or Red Auerbach.
I noticed this about you, Eamon. You have fun giving back in a multitude of different ways, whether it's coaching your son's basketball or other sports, or the philanthropy you do as it relates to lacrosse and raising money in urban communities. Where did that come from for you, and why it's so important for you to go beyond what others might do in trying to help out others?
I think it's twofold. I think the sport of lacrosse, deciding to play the sport of lacrosse as a junior at the Hill School, at high school, is probably one of the most impactful decisions on my life. And that might be overstating things, but I got to play for a great coach in Harry Price at the Hill, and then I was fortunate enough to become a college athlete. And that, playing a sport at Notre Dame, not everyone gets to say that. Not everyone gets to do that, and you make great friends. And I certainly can't diminish the impact it had on my broadcasting career. There were an explosion of college networks, CSTV, then ESPNU, that had to show a lot of, non-revenue Olympic sports, whatever you want to call it. And there weren't a whole lot of people out there with broadcasting experience that knew a whole lot about lacrosse. So that was my in for ESPNU. So that was my in to do play-by-play. I don't get to call, a Big Ten football game between Northwestern and Wisconsin without college lacrosse. Wow. And so it's that to give back to the game, but it's also to see the game grow and to help people who are doing an amazing job of teaching the sport and making it accessible. My focus is here in New York City with City Lax. I've also done work with Harlem Lacrosse and Bronx Lacrosse. And there's an organization in Chicago called Owls Lacrosse that I do some stuff with. But there are people out there that are doing amazing work to make the game grow. I am a diehard lacrosse supporter. I love the sport. I think it's one of the greatest sports out there. And it really irks me when people take shots at it and say it's a rich man's sport or a white man's sport. It needs to be diverse. Of course, it needs to be more diverse. I think every sport outside of football and basketball probably needs to be more diverse. But the only way it's going to become more diverse is if more people know about these organizations that are working their tails off to make the sport more accessible and to coach it up in areas that never had a chance to play lacrosse before. And that takes money and that takes volunteers. So if my little part of going on social media to tell you about City Lax will help someone donate $25, that's the least I could do. Obviously I've done a little bit more than that just because I've had the platform to do it. As the guy who called all the big time college lacrosse games for a while, people followed me and wanted to know more about it. So it was easy for me to do it. But I think it's, to get back to your original question, it's sort of a twofold approach, because I want to give back to the sport that's given me so much. And I want to see it be able to grow and become more diverse here in New York City.
Eamon McAnaney is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. It's unquantifiable, Eamon, how much you've done for lacrosse and you continue to do. And I love how that's sort of been a bridge for you, and how your first love or what you did in college and what you are infatuated with has opened up the doors to so many other opportunities. How close were you to being play-by-play for the Siberian Bobsledding League? Do you remember that from Instagram? I saw a mention from Instagram where somebody you mentioned that as some sort of, I'm sure, a little spoof.
Yeah, that's a way back down memory lane. Back in the day, you would have taken any job they offered you. I remember the first time ESPNU called me. They're like, "Look, Eamon, we really want to work with you on our college lacrosse package." I was like, "Yes," but before we do that, we're wondering if you're available this Saturday to call wrestling at West Point. And I'm like, wrestling at West Point in 3 days? Yeah, sure. So of course you take the date. And the only reason they offered it to me was because they didn't have to fly me or give me a hotel, because West Point's about an hour from New York City. So, I know a little bit about wrestling, but I know a lot more about, Hulk Hogan coming off the top rope and, or body slamming Andre the Giant at WrestleMania than I do about legit wrestling. But you study up, you get there, and you try to do the best job you can. So, I think the joke about the Siberian bobsledding team is that you'll take any gig offered to you and figure it out when you show up.
Well, you look at your career from when you were handing shot sheets to sportscasters, and you were doing that. Mike Tirico, I saw, a mention that, it was 2 a.m. and you were handing him shot sheets. And if you look at what you've done so far, to take your metaphor, you now are jumping off the top rope Hulk style from what you are doing in the world of sportscasting. But how formative were those early years for you in production as to how you got to where you are today?
It's everything. I 4.5, 5 years at ESPN has as much impact on me and has made me as much of an adult and a professional as I am, as any, as going to Notre Dame, as going to the Hill School, as any coach I ever had. It's just an amazing place. The standard that you're taught. I mean, I didn't know anything when I went there, really. I knew sports. I sort of had an idea of how to map out a highlight, but I didn't know anything about being in the edit room. But, there was a standard there that you had to meet. It was very competitive. But they also taught you. I mean, you look back, they didn't expect you to know it right away, but if they made a mistake in the attention to detail, sure, you got chewed out, but you also learned something. I mean, I still, when I start there, 1992, and I can tell you random examples of stuff that I was taught by Barry Sachs, Eric Smith, Scott Ackerson, Tim. We could go on, but and now I'm working with young people who are cutting highlights, and I'm passing that along. Just if I'll tell you one story, I was cutting a highlight of a Ranger game. I forget who they were playing, but it was at Madison Square Garden. And one of the fans used, the Jumbotron to propose, at the game. So that's how I started the highlight. And on the Jumbotron, it says, Diane, will you marry me, Steve? So that was my opening shot. And in a highlight, you have to put in the matchup in the courtesy. So Rangers, Blackhawks, courtesy MSG Network. And just 99 out of 100 times, we just put it in for the first 4 seconds. It was just absent-minded, 0-0 to 0-4 MSG Network. So, of course, that's what I did. So then that's what the director did. The director's reading the cut sheet and puts in the chyron, the graphic right over the Jumbotron. So you don't get to read it. So Barry Sachs pulls me aside and says, look, you got to pay attention. You blew the whole gig. You blew the whole joke because you covered up, will you marry me? And I didn't think about it for a second. So there you have to learn attention to detail. And maybe I'm sure it's like that in any industry, in any first job, but to want to work in sports, especially sports production, and to be at ESPN and work on SportsCenter, and to work with the people that I had the chance to work with on air and in production, and the people next to me, it was just an amazing experience. I'm not going to tell you it's a thrill a minute and it's the most exciting life. Everyone's heard about Bristol, but just to put this in perspective for you, when I was a PA there, the guy to my right was Scooter Vertino, who's now an executive at Turner and NBA TV. The guy to my left was John Entz, who was at MLB Network, Fox Sports. Seth Markman is now like the head honcho for the NFL studio programs on ESPN. So there were talented people. And if you didn't keep up with them, you were left behind. So, everything I learned about how to be a professional and how to show up and work and get the job done was taught to me at ESPN.
Hey, man, I would think another person in that peer group that you mentioned in the early days of ESPN when you were there was Manny Diaz. We all know what he's doing in college football, let go at Miami here recently, but he's had a lot of success in college football over the years. So what was it like cutting highlights with him and being around him at those early days?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think he's a year or two younger than I am. He came in a little bit behind me, but he was a Florida State guy. I was a Notre Dame guy, so we didn't see eye to eye about stuff on the football field because we had that big game, number 1 versus number 2, and Notre Dame won, but Florida State went on to win the championship. So we always had fun battles with that. But he was driven. I mean, he was driven back then. You could see it. And then I remember, so I left ESPN, I think in the spring of 96. I'm not sure when Manny left, but I started taking freelance production jobs. And I think it was the end of the 99 college football season going into the 2000 new year. Florida State plays Virginia Tech, Michael Vick, for the national championship in the Sugar Bowl. And I was a field producer for Fox Sports Net at the time. And I'm down on the field and there's Manny Diaz. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he was like a graduate assistant on the defense working with Mickey Andrews, their legendary defensive coordinator. So that's how I kind of saw him, change his life completely to go from television to coaching. And it's been an amazing run for him. I had the chance when I was doing games to call a Miami Duke game when he was the defensive coordinator. And, when you play-by-play and the color analyst gets to meet with the home team coaches. So that was, sort of a 180 or full circle moment to get to sit there and interview a guy who, 10 or 15 years earlier, we were scarfing down PA pizza on Saturday nights in Bristol, Connecticut.
It's been an amazing run for Manny. It's also been an amazing run for Mike Francesa. And I saw that you got to interview him not too long ago. What did you learn about him, seeing him in person, that you would not have if you were listening to an interview like that over the air, radio wise, by being in his presence? What did you pick up on?
Yeah, so we had a chance to interview Mike when he was doing one of his last shows. One of his last shows was done at the Museum of Broadcasting and Radio in Midtown Manhattan. And, I was a lifelong listener to that show. Mike and the Mad Dog came along when I was in college, and, it was, the first true great sports talk show in New York. And obviously they had an amazing run before Mad Dog went to Sirius. But, you just learn how important confidence is. I mean, obviously anyone who listens to that show knows how confident Mike is, how driven he was. And, the combination of, being smart and funny. When he and Mad Dog were on the air, it always amazed me how they worked off each other, and how Mike could be, very smart and very intelligent and give you all the background and history you needed to know, but yet at the same time, be a New York wise guy. And, you need some of that. It's sports. It's not brain surgery. And I think that's, kind of the key. How are you entertaining? How do you inform? And how do you make people laugh?
How do you reflect upon the way in which you want to perceive yourself on air, and how you want the listener to take in your message?
I want the viewer to have fun. I want the viewer, when they sit down to watch sports night, or, back in the day, watch a lacrosse game, they know that if I'm the host, or if I'm calling the game, that we're going to have some fun. It's not stand-up comedy, but, you have to have a little bit of a personality. The guy I always wanted to be, the two guys I always wanted to be when I was a kid, were Warner Wolf and Jerry Gerard. And they were entertaining and they were funny. It was a different world back then. You did 3.5 minutes and you made fun of the weatherman, and, Warner Wolf was amazing. Like, if you had the Jets in 24, you lost, or, and Mr. G was at the game. Jerry Gerard, the same way. And then, ESPN comes along, and you get to see the guys like Chris Berman and Tom Mees, and, they're having the time of their lives. And obviously Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann, we could go on and on about, the partners. So that's what I try to do. When I work with someone who I know I can have fun with, that's a blast. When you're getting in everyone's highlight and they're having fun with you and you're having fun with them. We have Mark Malusis and Sal Licata on every night. It's got to be fun and entertaining because it's sports. So, Al Michaels in his book, and I'm not comparing myself to Al Michaels at all, but in his books uses the term rascal. You got to be a little rascal every once in a while. And, it's nice to sneak some stuff in. And that's, that's what I try to be. We're there to have sports. We're there to do sports, and I'm trying to have fun and, be exciting. I want to be there, so you should want to be there, I guess, is what I try to get across to the viewer.
What's a zinger or a one-liner that you threw into a broadcast that you look back and you're like, man, that was so well timed, I nailed that?
I mean, there's one that comes to mind that's going to get me in trouble, but SNY had an event to welcome everyone back to to office, after the pandemic, since no one was really together for a while. The production staff was, because we came into the office, but everyone else was working remote. And so they organized an event for all the employees of SNY to go to a Met game. Well, of course, the production people were on at night. We can't go to that game. So, we were kind of, anyway, so we can't go to that game. So all the seats were in left field. Everyone sat together in left field. So sure enough, someone, I think it was on the Atlanta Braves, hit a 3-run shot right to the seats. And I say, whoever it wasn't Acuna because he was hurt, but let's say Ozzy Albies crashes the party. So no one at home knows what I'm saying, but everyone in the control room and at SNY knows exactly what I'm saying. So they all laughed their tail off. So in the newsroom, everyone got a good chuckle out of it, but but no one at home necessarily meant what I meant.
Yeah. Eamon McAnaney is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. What was, as we sort of think about your career as a whole, what was a defining moment for you, career defining, when an obstacle came and you found a way around it?
Geez, I don't know about an obstacle. I think back to, defining moments for me was when I was a sideline reporter for the Big East game of the week. I had a tremendous opportunity to work on that crew. John Kettering was the producer. Mike Kalisian was the tremendous play-by-play announcer. And John Kingemi, who I got to work with later on in play-by-play, was the analyst. And we were a close-knit group. And it was a great package to get my feet wet on, because a lot was asked of the sideline reporter because it was syndicated. So we had to fill like the first 7 minutes. We had to do sort of a pseudo pregame show. We had to fill halftime. And if the game ended early, we had to fill to like 3:30, I think. So there was no studio support for us. We were on our own little island. So we had to create content. So for the sideline reporter, that was great because a lot was asked of the sideline reporter, and I got to do a lot of cool stuff. So you go back, I forget the exact year, but unfortunately, Eric LeGrand suffers the injury at Rutgers, and can't walk. And we had on our game Rutgers' first game after that injury, and I was going to interview Greg Schiano on the field, before the game at like 11, and it was his first one-on-one interview that he had done. He had done some press conferences, but he had not done a one-on-one television interview. So I knew it was a huge opportunity. It was a huge opportunity to do well, huge opportunity to, fail. That's, it's the get, right? Now, fortunately for me, I had a very good relationship with Coach Schiano. I knew him well because I had covered high school sports and Rutgers for News 12 New Jersey and MSG for years. So I had interviewed him before. I had hung out with him at high school football games before, where you kind of let your guard down. So we knew each other. So he was familiar with me and I was familiar with him. So that alleviated for me some of the nerves. I was still nervous as heck. Luckily, they shot the interview very tightly because my hand on the microphone was shaking, because not only was it a huge interview, but you're not asking them, how are you going to stop Pittsburgh's run game? Like, this was a serious interview. And so it went really well. And it didn't just air on our game. It aired on Game Day. It aired across ESPN platforms. And I was told that afterwards, like, people like such as Chris Fowler and some other people were really, complimentary about it in the show meetings. So that was that's one that I always look back on as, I was throwing a 2-0 fastball and I hit it out of the park. I don't want to, joke about the subject matter, obviously. But, that's one that always stands out to me as, an opportunity where, it's sort of a defining moment for my career. As far as obstacles go, I just think the biggest one was, fighting through and sort of waiting out a chance, to become the main lacrosse announcer at ESPNU, because that was not by design. That did not happen overnight. I didn't get it right away. At some point, it didn't look good at all for my career that I was ever going to get that. So I just kept plugging and kept trying to improve and kept trying to get my style that I was confident with, so that when I did get that opportunity, I was ready.
How were you during those times, working on improving and refining your style so that you would present yourself in a better opportunity to get that position you were aiming for?
Yeah, I just, just took advantage of every opportunity and tried to get better, because I was not a natural play-by-play guy. I never thought I'd be a play-by-play guy. I'm sure you've heard those stories about the guys who always wanted to be the next Marv Albert, or, now the next Mike Breen. And, they would go to a game and sit by themselves and do play-by-play into a tape recorder, or they would do play-by-play at home. That was never my drive. Like I said, I always thought I'd be a guy at the studio and be Warner Wolf and make people laugh. So I didn't really have that foundation as a play-by-play guy when I got the opportunity. I certainly didn't turn it down, because I knew that, it was opening a door, and I knew I sort of had to get into that. So I kind of learned on the fly. So I watched a lot of myself back, which I don't do enough of now. And I just tried to prepare. And I hate to say treat it like a final exam, because you want to go back to the idea that it's fun, but I really did. I wanted to know as much as possible so that part was taken care of. The cadence and the calling of the game and the rhythm and, how to make something big, but not too big. You're only going to get that by reps. You can't, so that goes back to the practice. But my approach was to study as much as possible, so that if anything, kind of went haywire, you were prepared for it. You had that foundation of knowledge of the two teams. I couldn't imagine going into call a sporting event and not have the two teams on lockdown.
Yeah. And when I think about this is my final question for you. Eamon McAnaney is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. You think about all of those things that factor into what inspires you. And you look over the course of your career, your family and those who you've worked with, and that drive and that incessant desire to improve. How much inspiration do you gain and use with you to this day from another Eamon that used to be on this earth and has a similar last name in spelling as you?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I almost think about almost every day. I mean, that might be a little over the top now, but certainly, you think about what he was able to accomplish and the impact he made on people. We're talking about Eamon McAnaney, the All-American lacrosse player who passed away, unfortunately, on 9/11. when he was dominating at Cornell with Mike French and Richie Moran, the coach, for some reason that team got a lot of coverage. I don't know if it was because it was an Ivy League team or but they were on ABC Wide World of Sports. They were covered in the New York Times. Sports Illustrated wrote about them. So my parents used to show me all the clippings. So I read it, and you're reading about a guy. Not only does he have the same name as you, but it's Eamon McAnaney. There aren't a whole lot of Eamon McAnaneys in the world. So I wrote him a letter. And he wrote me back, and I have the letter to this day. And, I had a chance to meet him when I was a kid. I still have the picture. He played football as well. So he played football against Columbia, which is on the Upper West Side. My dad took me up to the game on the subway. We met him afterwards, and I always thought I was going to meet him again. We had all these friends, mutual friends, guys who worked with him on Wall Street, guys who knew him from Connecticut. A couple of times we we're going to go out for drinks down at the Seaport or down on Wall Street, and he had to cancel or I had to cancel. And then on 9/11, everyone's checking in on me to see if I'm doing okay. And I knew automatically what had happened. Obviously, like I said, there aren't a whole lot of Eamon McAnaneys, and I knew where he worked. But when he passed, you go to his funeral and you hear the way his college teammates talked about him. You hear the way Richie Moran talked about him, the way the people in New Canaan talked about him. It's a guy who got after life every day. And that's what you need to do. I mean, again, I'm not saying I do it. There's certainly plenty of days where I'm like, all right, let's just get through today. But, a guy who had everything going for him, and then just like that, it ends, but yet still was able to leave an amazing impact and leave an amazing legacy, not just because he was a great lacrosse player, but because of who he was as a person. You think about that, and just to tie in Cornell lacrosse, there's another Cornell lacrosse player named John Gordon, who's a tremendous motivational speaker. He always says, get to, I don't have to go to work. I get to go to work. I get to host at SNY. I get to, go play catch with my sons. And that's something I try to work, because as much as any broadcaster will tell you, this is my dream job, and I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. There's also that day where, like, wait a second, I got to get up at 4 a.m. to take a flight through Atlanta to get to Memphis to call Memphis UAB, and I got to get back. You have to realize that that's exactly what you wanted to do. This is exactly what I wanted to be, and I get to do this.
I see the impact of Eamon on your life, and I feel in a way that you're carrying the baton. And why I say that in large part, Eamon, is because of how much of an impact that Eamon had on others in philanthropy and being a role model and helping others. And I just see you doing that as well. So whether it's subconscious or whether it's conscious, you're carrying his spirit along. And that's one of the many reasons why you're someone we're all rooting for. Eamon McAnaney, SNY, on Twitter at EMACSNY. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley. Eamon, thanks for doing this, man. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me on. It was a great chat. Anytime. Thanks for having me on.